Good afternoon. Welcome to the Manetti Shrem Museum. My name is Juliana, and I'm a Visitor Services student staffer. Before we begin today's program, we should take a moment to acknowledge the land on which UC Davis sits. For thousands of years, this land has been home to the Patwin people. Today, there are 3 federally recognized Patwin tribes: Kachildihi Band of Wintoon Indians of the Calusa Indian Community, Quetzaldihi Wintoon Nation, and Yocha-Dihi Wintoon Nation. The Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliana. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Just for those of you in the front, take a look in the back. Look at this wonderful crowd out here at the Manetti Shrem Museum for this year's Templeton Colloquium. I'm extremely pleased, and I think it's a testament to the interest in today's topic and the interest in art history. My name is Adam Johnson, and I'm the Director of Museum Education and Community Connection here at the Manetti Shrem Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you here to the museum and to this year's Templeton Colloquium in Art History, Pacific Encounters. The museum is proud of the collaborative relationship that we have developed over the years with our art historian colleagues on campus, and we're honored to be the permanent home of this special annual event. Every year, the Templeton Colloquium brings to light the most pressing questions and issues in the world of art history. This year is no exception, with its focus on the Pacific, a vast is an understatement, geographical area that is central to very important scholarship. And of course, it is a topic that is near and dear to this museum by way of our academic liaison, Jennifer Wagley, whose area of specialty lies within Pacific art history. I look forward to all of the papers this afternoon, and like all of you, I'm eager to listen, to learn, and to engage. And now I'm very happy to turn the podium over to Dr. Catherine Burnett, Chair of the Art History Program in the Department of Art and Art History, and Faculty Director of the Global Tea Initiative for the Study of Tea Culture and Science. Catherine.
Well, thank you, Adam. And thank you to the Manetti Shrem for enabling us to use this wonderful facility. And welcome, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be with you. I, as you know, am the chair of art history, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to what arguably is our most important event of the year. Today, we bring together the art history community, friends of art history, faculty and students, undergrads and grads, alumni and prospective students. We're so happy to see you here. And all of you to celebrate all that is good about our program and about art history. What is really wonderful to us is that art history represents really deep intellectual curiosity, interdisciplinary approaches, and the opportunity to delve deeply into areas that chances are are not what most people normally think about on a daily basis. Today, we celebrate our stellar faculty and the fact that the program in art history at UC Davis is, quite frankly, one of the most progressive such programs in the entire US. And because we get to work with amazing students, we are also celebrating our wonderful students. Today, we especially get to celebrate Mr. Alan Templeton, our art history alum, whose passion and deep knowledge about art history spurred him to endow funds to the university to ensure that 18th century European art will always be studied. Alan, please stand and be recognized. We celebrate that these endowment funds have been put to such good use in the hire of my colleague and now also friend, Dr. Michael Yonan, the inaugural Templeton Endowed Professor of European Art, who coincidentally is the convener of today's event. About today's event, I will let him tell you more. In the meantime, I will invite him to the stage, but now you, please sit back, make yourselves comfortable, and get ready for some fascinating talks. Professor Yonan.
Thank you so much. And boy, is it exciting to see this enormous crowd of people here. It's just a delightful thing to see how much attention this has gotten. We are standing room only in the back of the hall, which is delightful. I'm most happy to welcome you to this annual Templeton Colloquium in Art History. By my count, this is the 10th, so it is actually our 10th anniversary this year, which is a wonderful thing. Yay! Our theme this year, as you know, is Pacific Encounters, and I'll say more about that in a moment. But it's my great pleasure to be able to welcome the three speakers who are going to speak in a moment, and of course all of you, to think about a region of the globe that is very interesting, and hopefully learn about its art and cultures, and earn those art and cultures new admirers and appreciators. I want to say that the choice of this subject for the colloquium was largely student-driven. Many UC Davis students have personal or family connections to the Pacific regions, while yet more have visited parts of the Pacific, kindling a desire to know more about their people and their art. When I've covered Pacific arts in my courses, which happens occasionally, the student response has been very enthusiastic. But today's colloquium does come with one caveat, which Adam alluded to a moment ago, which is that the Pacific is a very, very big ocean, right? So there's no way that we are going to cover everything today, right? And we didn't try really to make any attempt to do that comprehensively. So we've been a little bit selective, concentrating on Hawaii, a part of the world that many UC Davis students have a connection to, and going a little bit farther south to New Zealand, Aotearoa, a part of the world that is very interesting and maybe will be new to some people in the room. If today's talks stimulate a desire to learn more about cultures that we will not have time to mention today, all the better. I would like to make a few comments of thanks to the many people who have been involved in putting this together. Of course, thank you to my colleagues in the Department of Art and Art History, and particularly to our graduate students in the master's program who have been exceptionally involved in this year's planning, more so than I think even usually. Thanks as well to the staff of Manetti Shrem for their co-sponsorship of today's event. And I would like to single out particularly Jennifer Wagley, academic liaison, whose counsel was invaluable in planning today's experience. Huge thanks go to Leah Tice and Lisa Zadibel, who are the support staff for art history, without whose tireless work, and I must say tireless, we would never, ever, ever be able to do this. They are crucial to what we do and just invaluable members of our community. And of course, heartfelt thanks to Alan Templeton himself, our benefactor, whose continued generosity, love of the humanities, and stewardship of the arts has so enriched the arts renaissance that has taken place at UC Davis in the last several years. Thank you, Alan. So now I would like to introduce Dean Estella Ataquana, Dean of the College of Letters and Science. Dean Ataquana provides academic and administrative leadership for the largest college on campus, Letters and Science, overseeing 36 departments with more than 900 faculty across the arts, humanities, social sciences, and mathematical and physical sciences. Ataquana began her tenure as Dean of the College of Letters and Science relatively recently in August of 2021. She is a renowned geophysicist whose research interests include biogeophysics and tectonophysics, and she is a fellow of the Geological Society of America. Dean Ataquana is passionate about supporting student success and is a champion of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and is herself a first-generation student. Welcome, Dean Ataquana.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, for that introduction, and what a pleasure to see all of you here everybody looks so eager, anticipating to listen to the wonderful lectures. Let me just also join Michael in saying thank you so much to the Department of, Art History and the students, especially for putting up this wonderful show today, or this event today. So before I really begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge and thank Alan Templeton for his generous support of UC Davis, especially Letters and Science. And as it's already been mentioned, this is the 10th year of the Templeton Colloquium. And so for 10 straight years, we have been gifted the opportunity to examine languages, literature, culture, and art through an interdisciplinary lens. The art history program at LNS focuses on social truths as learned or advanced through painting, sculpture, architecture, photography, and other fine arts. Our students are empowered to connect the dots of literature, history, critical theory, philosophy, anthropology, and cultural studies to create a mosaic that informs our collective path forward. The level of work being done in our art history program is of tremendous pride to all of us. Alan, we can't thank you enough for your help in sustaining and advancing this valuable program. Your contributions not only benefit those of us who have gathered here today, but our students, faculty, and of course, global scholarship. This year's theme, Pacific Encounters, examines the impact of the world's largest ocean and its many societies and cultures on the bigger world. This concept feels very familiar and relevant to me for several reasons. Like the Pacific, our college is the largest on campus and very diverse. And like the Pacific, we're a source of wonder and appeal and a place known for magnificent diversity and power. Because I serve as a dean, I have the pleasure of being able to attend functions and events such as this. And it's been it's been a real pleasure for me to attend this colloquium. And I'm happy to be able to apply a new lens to something so large with great interest. And I always find myself connecting dots between the specific subject and some facet of our college. Today, we will hear from 3 speakers, each of whom will provide us that opportunity to focus on one area of this massive entity so that we can better understand its holistic beauty and value. So today we'll hear from Dr. Ellis, who has traveled so far away from New Zealand. I've always wanted to go to New Zealand. And so she's coming from the University of Auckland in New Zealand and studies how oral and Taonga histories and archival research provide insight into ceremonial, political, and economic roles in the Maori communities. I'm really looking forward to hearing that. Dr. Kamiro, Associate Professor from UC Santa Cruz, examines the politics of art organizations following the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy, overseas travel's role in maintaining Hawaiian independence, Hawaii's relations with the U.S. Empire, and more. And Dr. Polzak, Assistant Professor in History of Art and Visual Culture at UC Santa Cruz, examines the graphic and printed works created in relation to the so-called voyages of discovery conducted by Britain, France, and Russia. I hope that, like me, you take away from today's event not just a better understanding of these individual topics, but perhaps a better understanding and appreciation of the bigger picture. So now I'm going to turn it back to Michael and enjoy the event.
Thank you, Dean Atakwana. So to introduce our first speaker is Sienna Weldon, MA candidate in art history at UC Davis.
Thank you. Dr. Stacy Kamahiro, Associate Professor in the History of Art and Visual Culture at UC Santa Cruz, and Executive Editor for the Journal of the Pacific Arts Association, is a scholar of the visual culture of colonial Hawaii. Her recent scholarship analyzes Hawaiian politics after the overthrow of the monarchy, the efforts of King Kalakaua in maintaining Hawaii's independence, Hawaiian featherwork as cultural affirmation, and the U.S. empire and art history. Her current book project, Objects of the Nation, Hawaii at the World Fairs, examines collections and exhibitions of Hawaiian material culture and natural history in local and international contexts. Previous publications include her book, The Arts of Kingship, Hawaiian Art and National Culture of the Kalakaua Era, as well as a host of articles and contributions. Today, she presents her lecture titled Worlding the Kingdom of Hawaii, King Kalakaua and the Art of International Relations. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sienna. It was really lovely. Sorry. Okay, and thank you all. Wow, it does look vast out there. Well, as a guest of UC Davis, I join your community in recognizing the history and presence of the indigenous Patwin peoples on whose land the Davis campus is located. And I am honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional land, gathered here with you. I'd also like to extend my heartfelt thanks to Professor Yonan for inviting me to participate in today's event and for organizing the colloquium. You've put together a really wonderful program, and I'm honored to be part of it. I'd also like to thank Lisa, who I feel is like a friend now. We've done so many emails together, for so carefully attending to all of the details of our visit. I know it's a lot of work, and it's greatly appreciated by all of us. I'm deeply grateful to Mr. Alan Templeton and UC Davis's History of Art and Architecture Department for hosting us and making conversations like this possible. I very much value the opportunities to learn from students and colleagues, so thank you very much for having me. Okay, let me just change my slide. So my talk is called Worlding the Kingdom of Hawaii, King Kalakaua, and the Art of International Relations. Pacific encounters are often characterized as interactions between Europeans and Americans who visited or settled in the islands, and between them and the Kanaka Oiwi, the native Hawaiians who lived in, who are already there. So, people who came from all over the place and then came here, they kind of frame Pacific encounters in that way. Historians have given less consideration to Native Hawaiians who traveled abroad and actively initiated transoceanic and transregional exchanges that stimulated new cultural and visual cultural forms. Travel and the resulting relationships developed through global movements provided a pathway for the Hawaiian nation's survival. Travel was a means of worlding, challenging the cultural, social, and political borders and boundaries imposed on the Hawaiian kingdom by Europeans and Americans. So that would be characterized as small, or heathen, or controllable, or possessible, the islands. Travel furthered a more expansive indigenous orientation and presence in the world, forging alliances with other countries, demonstrating affinities between Hawaii and other enlightened nations, and also signaling the unique contribution Hawaii could make to world culture and civilization. I focus on the international travel of the native Hawaiian king, Kalakaua, and how his global journey deeply impacted the visual and material culture that emerged through his reign. David Kalakaua was the monarch of the Hawaiian kingdom from 1874 to 1891, and you see him pictured here. One of his prevailing concerns was to secure international recognition of the kingdom's sovereignty, especially in light of increasingly aggressive moves on the part of American settlers who desired more political and economic control. Native Hawaiian nationalism was, in part, tied to internationalism. It integrated visual forms and cultural institutions that denoted universal notions of modernity, what Lofgren calls an international grammar of nationhood. Kalakaua engaged in an extensive and multifaceted foreign relations program, but I focus on the visual and material culture of the global tour he took in 1881 as a means of worlding Hawaii to preserve its independence. Images and objects made voyages of their own, critically enabling the relationships the king cultivated with other rulers and nations. They can be understood as creative, ongoing processes and products of complex cultural entanglements that give form to a community's values and social relations, manifesting ways of being in the world. As they entered into various social contexts and fields of vision, their meanings were transformed while they also transformed the social relations they enacted. Images and objects shaped cross-cultural encounters in the numerous interactions between Kalakaua and other state leaders and the movements of the king through diverse cultural settings during his overseas tour. They contributed to forming his ideas about Hawaii, its relationships to other nations, and other peoples, its place in the world, and its future. Kalakaua was the first head of state in the world to circumnavigate the globe. His tour is significant in that, as anthropologist Nicholas Thomas suggests, travel is a peculiarly modern activity insofar as it entails expansive steps away from traditional ties and, more crucially and distinctively, an attitude of extension and displacement toward those traditions. Travel has also been widely regarded, not least by anti- and post-colonial critics, as an enlarging and liberating process that unsettles the confidence of colonial authority. In traversing the globe, Kalakaua can be understood as bridging colonial borderlands as well as geographical boundaries. And here's a map of his tour. So he starts in Honolulu, goes to San Francisco, and then heads towards Asia. So they can kind of see where he goes from there and follow his pathway. And then this gets a little bit, he goes all over. So here's a blow-up of that particular chunk before he heads back to the United States and back to Honolulu. Now, at the Bon Voyage state dinner held at the Hawaiian Hotel in January of 1881, attended by political and social leaders and foreign diplomats, Kalakaua stated, and this is a quote, "Around this table are gathered people of many nations. In common with my predecessors, I desire the best welfare of all who gather under our flag in my dominions. And I believe that you who come from other lands, bringing with you the wealth, enterprise, and intelligence of those lands, sympathize with me in my desire to protect my native Hawaiian people and strengthen my nation. We have many difficult questions to settle arising out of our peculiar situation. They demand the best statesmanship and patient investigation. I am in hopes, while absent, to gather some ideas which shall aid in their solution." So this is why he's taking the trip. End quote, by the way. What was this peculiar situation to which the king referred? The Hawaiian kingdom at this time was largely comprised of native Hawaiians and Europeans and Americans, some of whom were born in Hawaii, others who had arrived decades earlier as missionaries and businessmen, and other more recent arrivals. And though the indigenous population was in the majority, it was steadily decreasing, while the non-indigenous population was growing and progressively controlling the wealth of the nation. The king, therefore, needed to navigate the difficult passage between securing the welfare of his indigenous subjects and resisting the increasingly contentious white elite who sought control of the government. For the white business and plantation communities, Kalakaua's journey promised to enhance their prosperity by acquiring inexpensive labor and furthering international commerce, developing markets for their goods. Native Hawaiian citizens understood the king's purpose differently and emphasized the good he was trying to do for them. At a church service held a few days before the king's departure, John Makini Kapena, a member of the House of Nobles in the Hawaiian legislature, remarked on Kalakaua's accomplishments in raising the standard of living for Native Hawaiians, yet stated, here's a quote, "All this wealth is of no use if there is to be only a mere handful of us left. The king himself would be so only in name if he had no people to rule. The great nations now look with respect on this little kingdom and will have still more when they see our king traveling among them for information to benefit his people." End quote. So the king's voyaging, literally, and in terms of his engagement with the symbolic realm of modern internationalism, was an apt strategy for cultural and political survival, because Kalakaua and his kingdom garnered more positive attention in overseas publications, which were not as steeped in the hostile American missionary and business rhetoric emanating from within the Hawaiian Islands. Foreign presses typically represented Kalakaua as a popular, educated, and capable ruler, and remarked on the kingdom's modern forms of government, education, and social life. It was in this open space that the king inserted his internationalist and nationalist agenda. And this is just one example I thought I'd put up because it had good visuals too. So you do see Kalakaua here, but he's, visually, he's represented pretty equally to like Lord Hatherley and the Reverend John Cumming. There's not like, in any way is he being sort of represented in a poor way. And that's just visually. The text as well, here's the article on the king that continues on, also represents him quite equally, respectfully, and so forth. So the foreign press was much kinder to the Hawaiian king. But I'm now going to share a few, now that we kind of have set up, like, why is he going? Why is it important to him? I wanted to share a few visual and material culture examples that kind of emerged from his travel. Oh, it's working. So as the king wound his way through distant seas and across foreign lands, he was concerned with how he presented himself and his suite to others. Having studied the impressive court and military attire of different nations, he ordered new uniforms for himself and his traveling companions and designed them to resemble European models, but with a distinctly Hawaiian accent. The cloth was delicately worked with gold wire to create images of kalo or taro, the leaves of kalo, and an indigenous fern. The motifs projected a statement about the Hawaiian kingdom and its ruler through an international sartorial idiom. I have a detail here. The kalo motif offered a rich statement of the king's responsibility to safeguard the fruitfulness of the land and its people. Kalo, a Hawaiian staple, was designated the national dish, and in Hawaiian cosmogony was a sibling to the people, a very close relationship between people and taro. It was a source of sustenance and linked people to the land, or aina, and its origins. The fern motif has multi-layered significance. It references the idea of an open hand and a gesture of beckoning. This aligns with Kalakaua's invitation to foreign rulers to engage him as a legitimate ruler and with friendship. The fern is also associated with Laka, the deity of inspiration and abundance, and in its medicinal functions is linked to health and healing, in this case that of the Hawaiian nation. The exchange of royal orders, typically composed of elaborate insignia accompanied by a collar, a sash, and a chain, also facilitated overseas foreign relations. These were bestowed by a ruler to recognize outstanding service or achievement, or to acknowledge fraternity among state leaders. Prior to his world tour, Kalakaua received royal orders from several European heads of state, and he proudly wore these, in addition to the Hawaiian royal orders, because they had their own, and you can see a few of those on the right side there. And he wore both during his travels. The king linked the exchange of royal decorations, as they were called, to his policy of ho'oulu lahui, increase the nation, which in part sought kindred races to emigrate to Hawaii to fortify the indigenous population through intermarriage. So as I mentioned before, the native Hawaiian population was declining in large part due to introduced diseases to which they had no immunities. In a letter written from Singapore, he stated, quote, "By these exchanges of royal orders depends the success of any future movement our government may take in desiring to produce immigrants from Japan, China, Siam, and Johor. Decorations have a powerful weight upon the minds of the Asiatic princes. It would do us no harm to reciprocate and establish goodwill and feeling between our country and those of Asia," end quote. So you can see the link of these objects to other kinds of political and national goals of the king. He placed particular value on exchanging decorations with Asia-Pacific nations because he felt a strong cultural affinity with them and wished to cultivate closer ties as a means of resisting American encroachments on Hawaiian sovereignty. So you can see examples from Japan and Siam here. Kalakaua had long contemplated the possibility of a common ancestry between Polynesians and Asians and discussed this with the Japanese emperor, the King of Siam, the Maharaja of Johor, and others during his world tour. All concurred, and he's reporting on this in his journal. So that's what we see from, we get a sense of what they were talking about and how he's reflecting on their conversations. But all concurred with the idea that they shared Malay blood and cultural similarities. As the king left Johor, he remarked that he had confirmed that his own people were Asiatics and that he hoped the Asian nations would become powerful and stand by one another by becoming a part of an oceanic confederacy. During his trip, he exchanged orders with, and pardon the list, with the rulers of Siam, Japan, Johor, Italy, Sweden and Norway, Belgium, Spain, Portugal, Scotland, England, Russia, Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire, Egypt, Tunis, the Netherlands, Romania, the Pope, and others. That's actually not a complete list, but a lot of people that he engaged with. Royal decorations were not mere baubles, and their exchange was not a trivial gesture. They were costly and highly regarded expressions of international fellowship. The often personalized exchange and formal public display of these insignia materialized the personal relationships between world leaders and between nations. The medals projected the respect and friendship of those who conferred them and became part of the recipient's own ongoing identity formation. These objects had agency, enacting human object intersubjectivity and co-production. And so this is the collection of the royal orders and decorations that King Kalakaua and his queen, Kapi'olani, had collected, and it was on display in their home in Waikiki. It's a lot. Now, though not a formal royal order, Kalakaua specially designed the World Tour Medal while in Paris to commemorate both his trips to the United States in 1874 to secure a reciprocity treaty, a trade agreement, and his global circuit in 1881, the one I'm focusing on now. The medal consists of an 8-pointed Maltese cross symbolizing the 8 major islands of the Hawaiian archipelago, and it's attached to a red ribbon, which red refers to the sanctity of indigenous rule. On a silver scroll above the cross are engraved the dates of travel. It's a little hard to see, but you can see 1874, 1881 there. And on the opposite side, the motto, "Faithful and true," is engraved, and as he remained faithful and true to his native Hawaiian constituents. In the center of the cross is an enameled globe affixed by its axis around which it can rotate. So you can kind of see this little axis here, and this thing twirls, it moves around. The feature of movement suggests Kalakaua's own mobility as he traversed the globe. The medal is very rare, and as the king had only created 8 of them to confer on his traveling suite and himself. It served as a unique reminder of his world tour undertaken to safeguard the welfare of his people and demonstrate his faith in their future. Photography, too, played a key role in documenting the king's travels and the personal relationships that he cultivated. Kalakaua commemorated the beginning of his historic journey with a group portrait of himself and his suite on the left side there, Colonel Charles Judd and Colonel George McFarland, taken by Isaiah West Tabor in San Francisco. That was his first stop on his trip. He also prepared portraits of himself and his queen, Kapi'olani, to gift to other notable individuals, such as the Emperor of Japan. In Japan, he sat for another group portrait with Prince Yoshiaki and government officials, and you can see that on the right, and I've identified some of those up there. The photograph shows the men dressed in modest clothing and evokes an entry in Kalakaua's journal describing his reception at the Japanese Imperial Palace. And he writes, "The impression on my mind was really awesome and grand. Stately as all the surroundings appeared, there was an air of cordiality natural freedoms assumed during the whole of the interview, which made it a contrast to the stiffness of European courts, especially England. And I think this kind of more informal posing and clothing kind of speaks to his impression of that visit. Now, during this visit, Kalakaua proposed a federation of Asiatic nations to be led by Japan and Hawaii, and suggested uniting the two royal families through marriage. The king's detailed journal entries from Japan contemplated how different people, cultural values, and religions could coexist in his own kingdom, as he had witnessed in Japan. The photograph of the Kalakaua group and his Japanese hosts, in combination with the several valuable gifts he received from the emperor, offered a palpable and lasting material connection and diminished the distance between the two nations. In addition to touring Asia, Kalakaua visited numerous European countries. In England, his hosts included Sir Thomas and Lady Brassey, and his stay is documented by at least 2 photographs. In one, here, the king and the Brasseys share a seat in the center foreground surrounded by British aristocrats. So here's the king, here's Lord Brassey, here's Lady Brassey, and then that's one of the colonels that he's traveling with. So they're all sharing this seat and surrounded by lots of people. The other shows Kalakaua seated next to the host couple at a luncheon given in his honor at the Brassey Institute in Hastings. And it was actually a really big to-do. It wasn't just a lunch. There were some public gatherings and speeches by the mayor and gift exchanges, and there was all of this. So this was a lunch kind of at the end of the day. That several of the photographs I have shown include numerous people suggests the broad acceptance and respect for the king as a social peer. His positioning in the pictures, seated on the same sofa and directly adjacent to his royal and noble hosts, gestures to his equal standing and the honorable reception he received in different parts of the world. Additionally, the informal yet fashionable dress of the sitters in these and other images marks the fact that these were not stiffly posed formal court portraits, but rather indicates an easy and sincere camaraderie among those assembled. In the picture here, you can see the king back here next to Lady Brassey. And then, kind of the informality, too, of having children, and, it's sort of just a snapshot in time rather than a stiffly posed portrait. And here's another example that relates to what I'm describing. This portrait shows the Hawaiian king in Hong Kong, where he was extravagantly hosted by Sir John Pope Hennessy, the governor of this crown colony, on behalf of the British Queen. Hennessy arranged a Masonic reception, a grand banquet, and a public reception for Kalakaua. The king was gratified by the large gathering of the colony's military, business, and political leaders who had come to honor him on very short notice, as his visit had not been announced in advance. The men in the picture are similarly attired in casual clothes and informally posed, suggesting sociability and fellowship among equals. The photographs taken in Japan, England, and Hong Kong, the ones I've been showing you, materialized the various events, temporally extending these fleeting encounters and creating lasting mementos of global friendships. And I'll share one last example. So while in London, Kalakaua had his full dress portrait taken by the studio of Dickinson Brothers and Foster, which served the royal and noble families of England. The portrait presents the king with a serious and studied visage and reflects his recent international engagements through the display of Asian, European, and Hawaiian royal orders on his chest. This particular print was signed by the king and includes his inscription that reads, quote, "To His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, London, July 23rd, 1881, end quote. He presented this portrait during his private audience with Queen Victoria and then departed to continue his European circuit. And when he returned to London a few months later in September, he met with the Prince and Princess of Wales, where he was gifted a large, 14 by 22 inch signed photograph of the prince mounted in a solid silver frame. So these kinds of exchanges created relationships between rulers. So to conclude, Kalakaua's trip around the world, mediated by a variety of visual images and material culture forms, enlarged his vision of himself and his kingdom. whether by designing his self-presentation through clothing, forming relationships through the exchange of gifts, royal orders, and portraits, documenting his encounters with different places and peoples through photographs, or studying new technologies and transplanting these to Hawaii, which I didn't talk about today, but the king devised ways to insert himself into global visibility and recognition and validate his and his kingdom's sovereignty. At the same time, he carried his experiences home, prompting him to see things in new ways and bolstering his confidence and determination to forge creative solutions to advance his nation. Kalakaua's international interactions and observations were brought to bear on his voyaging strategies for securing the welfare of Native Hawaiians, as well as negotiating the complexities of his multicultural, multi-ethnic kingdom. Thank you.
Introducing our next speaker is Hunter Kiley, MA candidate in art history at UC Davis.
Hello. Our next speaker, Kalani Polzak, is an assistant professor in history of art and visual culture at UC Santa Cruz. Dr. Polzak's research focuses on European visual culture in the 18th and 19th centuries, with particular attention to histories of science, aesthetic philosophy, race, colonialism, and intercultural contact in Oceania. Her current book project, Difference Over Distance, Visualizing Contact Between Europe and Oceania, examines the graphic and printed works created in relation to the so-called voyages of discovery conducted by Britain, France, Russia, and Aotearoa, New Zealand, Australia, and Hawaii in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Dr. Polzak was recently awarded the Getty and ACLS Postdoctoral Fellowship in the History of Art for 2022 and 2023. And today, Dr. Polzak's presentation will discuss regarding Kamehameha I, class, gender, and genre in the portraits by Louis Chori. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kalani Polzak.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Hunter, for that introduction. I'd also like to express my gratitude to Michael Yonan for organizing this year's symposium and inviting me, and for the energizing hospitality of Jennifer Wagley, Lisa Zadibble, and Alan Templeton during my visit here to UC Davis. It's an honor to be here with all of you. Thank you for this really generous attendance on a kind of windy, cold day. And also to be in dialogue with Stacy and Narino. It's not every day that I, as a European specialist, get to talk to scholars whose work has so greatly impacted the way I approach European visual culture. As Hunter revealed to you, I'm an art historian whose approach to 18th and 19th century Europe stems from the mutually determining histories of visual culture and empire, including visual constructions of race and geography in the Pacific. But more personally, I am descended from great-grandparents who left the Philippines to follow American agribusiness to Hawaii and contributed to the erosion of Hawaiian sovereignty. As such, I think about that part of my own biography, as well as the fact that I've spent most of my life living on Miwok, Ohlone, and Mohican homelands. And so I think it's only fair, as we consider erasures of voices, deeds, and presence, to remind ourselves yet again throughout today the land on which we are gathered and the Patwin people who steward it through generations past, present, and future. The work that I'll be sharing with you today stems from my current book project that considers not only the impact of European voyages to the Pacific and the construction of racial difference, but also the role that art history, a discipline that developed simultaneously with many ideas that form the bedrock of modern notions of race, played in articulating inequality through the terms of art, beauty, and civility. And granted, this work can be somewhat deflating at times, but I would hope that you would leave today also thinking that art history might be the very field that possesses the skills to denaturalize that past. I do not know how many among us today were familiar with the name Louis Chori. He also goes by Ludwig Chorus. I don't know how many of you were familiar when you saw the description of this colloquium. Shori was born in what is now the Ukraine, and at the age of 20 was hired as the voyage artist for a circumnavigatory expedition sponsored by a chancellor for the Russian Empire. When I began to research his 1822 publication entitled Voyage pittoresque autour du monde, or Picturesque Voyage Around the World, an account of his travels from 1815 to 1818 on this expedition, I realized that several of his compositions were already familiar to me. I had encountered them numerous times throughout my life. In the Bay Area and Santa Cruz, local history museums and state parks frequently rely on Shori's prints to illustrate the history of the region. And here I'm showing you a Bay Area institution's land acknowledgement. I've redacted their name because I'm not here to indict them, but to reveal to us how much we rely on Shori to represent our local past here in Northern California. I cannot address the full scope of Shori's publication, which provides pictorial and textual descriptions of Kamchatka, Rapa Nui, Chile, San Francisco, Hawaii, the Marshall Islands, the Philippines, and Aleutian Islands. Instead, I'm focusing on his portrait or portraits of King Kamehameha I, the monarch of Hawaii, about 50 to 60 years before the talk you just heard from my wonderful colleague, Stacey Kamahiro. And I actually love that you don't have us in chronological order. We should be thinking about the past expansively. In his voyage account, Shori describes the November 1816 morning when he met Kamehameha, King of Hawaii. Before even anchoring in Kealakekua Bay on the island of Hawaii, the Russian crew encountered, according to the artist, several thousand armed islanders assembled on the shore, a few hundred among them with rifles. These men led Shori and the two voyage naturalists to the Hawaiian king, whom they found seated on a mat with a large piece of black fabric that they described as of indigenous manufacture draped over his shoulders. The king initially received the delegation quite coldly because an American captain had suggested that the Russians had come to overthrow him in the name of the Tsar. Luckily for this delegation, they had an insider in their midst, a physician who had previously served Kamehameha and had joined the expedition in San Francisco, agreeing to act as their interpreter in Hawaii. Once the physician testified to the expedition's scientific intentions rather than ambitions to conquer the islands, Kamehameha not only promised the crew aid and provisions, he said that he took satisfaction in aiding an expedition of discovery. The plate depicting Kamehameha and the picturesque voyage is, at first glance, what one might expect from an artist aboard a so-called voyage of discovery. Oriented toward the viewer for maximum visibility, a visibly dark-skinned man is wrapped in a simple cloak in front of a coastal landscape. The revelation of the figure's bare sternum underscores what a European viewer would associate at that time with a so-called exotic origin. Indeed, we might be tempted to dismiss this lithographed plate as just a typical ethnographic voyage illustration from the early 19th century. Yet, a perusal of the other plates in Shori's voyage picturesque suggests otherwise. Only one other figure, Kamehameha's brother-in-law, is portrayed in this oval-shaped composition. By contrast, high-ranking men from the Marshall Islands, further west in the Pacific, are depicted against the blank background of the paper's surface, isolated on their respective pages. Unlike Kamehameha, most plates showing indigenous persons are composed either as these figures on the blank page, or they're set into ethnographic vignettes showing scenes of dances or cultural events. So the Kamehameha plate does not fully belong to either of these sort of ethnographic vignette categories or the isolated typological figure on the blank page. We might propose that it hews closer to the genre of portraiture. And Shori uses the word portrait liberally throughout his text in the picturesque voyage, where he broadly just means it any time he represents a human person. The frontispiece to the picturesque voyage recognizably follows the conventions of a formal portrait, and I'm showing that to you at left here. I'm not going to be able to get this pointer to work, so we're just going to bear with. So he includes conventions of a formal portrait, and that he's purporting to convey the likeness of a specific person, in this case the voyage's sponsor, Count Rumyantsev, at left. And Harry Lieberstone has argued that the parallels in the poses of the sitters between Count Rumyantsev and Kamehameha, in terms of the directness of their gazes, the lack of symbolic objects in each plate, contribute to a sense of parity between the Hawaiian king and the Russian count. But I want us to compare a little bit further, and I have kept the third plate in just to allow for a comparative foil for our discussion. Choury made careful use of the lithographic crayon's ability to convey tone in order to model Rumyantsev's sharp cheekbones and high forehead. But he deliberately minimized the illusion of the space that he depicted, using diagonal gestures across the background. And therein lies a major difference between the Rumyantsev and Kamehameha plates. Were Kamehameha rendered in such an abstract space, it would be more difficult to distinguish the Hawaiian monarch from the pages where individual figures are seated or situated against the blank page. The king's background instead features a landscape, specifically with a three-masted ship. It still bears lines of invisible gestural quality that are not found in the other more carefully delineated landscapes of the volume. So Kamehameha then presides over a space somewhere between the realm of the patron portrait and then the subject located in a specific locale. The somewhat unresolved status of this picture suitably indexes the successes and failures of negotiation that led to its creation. And Choury describes this process in the text of his picturesque voyage, stating that he asked Kamehameha for permission to make his portrait. This proposition appeared to please him very much, but he invited me to leave for a moment because he wanted to get dressed. He did not dally long before calling me to return. If only one could judge my surprise in seeing this monarch arrive in the dress of a sailor. He had on blue pants, a red vest, a clean white shirt, and a yellow silk cravat. I entreated him to change his costume, but he absolutely refused and insisted he wanted to be painted as he was dressed. In the plate, he is represented in his black robe. So Choury's anecdote begins with the monarch happily assenting to his first portrait drawn from life, then changing from his initial ensemble to garments that Choury thought to be more of common European dress, and then denied the artist pleas to change back into his initial outfit. It is remarkable to me that Choury provides his reader in the book's text with this precise narrative to be painted as he was dressed, and then ultimately overrides those desires in the accompanying illustration. You've probably been sitting here being like, where is the red vest and yellow silk cravat? Do you have the wrong slide up? No, this is how the voyage gets published. And Choury makes no effort in his text to justify why he refused to respect the king's wishes. He conspicuously goes against the unspoken rule of a voyage publication to give the impression of direct observation without interference. And we know that this is a myth, but it's pretty unusual for someone to make it this obvious for us. Instead, he chose to depict Kamehameha as he first encountered the Hawaiian king. And this process of alteration from the initial robe to the red vest outfit back to the robe is actually visible when we compare the preparatory sketch in Hawaii to the print. So I'm showing you at left what is largely recognized to be the preparatory sketch for the lithograph. And then we have a copy that seems to be in Choury's own hand that's in the collection of the Bishop Museum that appears to be in that initial red vest, yellow silk cravat outfit. So it gives us a sense of what the portrait sitting looked like. In the preparatory sketch, we see that Kamehameha's likeness once again stares out from an oval. His bare chest is draped with a dark colored cloth. The lithograph reverses the original, but I just want you to know that that's a routine operation of printmaking that doesn't actually have a significant artistic purpose. Unlike the final print, however, there are faint lines that cross the neck and sternum, and the art historian Jean Charlot conducted an almost forensic analysis of this sketch, and it's really kind of shocking to me that no one noticed this before 1954 when Charlot did this study. But if you look closely, this diagonal here and here corresponds to the opening in the red vest. We can see the sort of swoop of the knot, of the tied cravat, and even the outline of the lapel here. We don't have great lighting right now, unfortunately, to see this in the detail that we might want. But essentially, Charlot's analysis revealed that this red vest portrait likely lies underneath the watercolor and that it has been painted over even in the preparatory stage of the initial drawing. He proposed that, Charlot proposes that we have Charlot and Choury, that's not a fun combo to keep straight. Charlot proposes that Choury made this repainted study before even leaving the Hawaiian Islands. I cannot offer you a verifiable answer as to why it was so important to Kamehameha to be depicted in this particular European outfit and not the kapa, or bark cloth robe, he deemed suitable for initially meeting his Russian visitors. The kapa cloak might have seemed appropriate among his own people in whom he was loath to foster cupidity, but for a king of 7 islands, 6 years into a prosperous reign that had support from the British crown and was economically bolstered by trade with New England merchants, perhaps the cloak did not sufficiently convey his worldliness. After all, this was a king who offered the Russian crew dinner on porcelain from China and served them Madeira thereafter. But rather than speculate, I will say that it was known in the 19th century that Kamehameha was not born to the very highest ranks of Hawaiian ali'i, or chiefs, but through notable feats, military campaigns, and political negotiations became king of the Hawaiian archipelago. Merchants and navigators in the 19th century wrote about how he oversaw the trade of Hawaiian sandalwood to China. And, as Choury noted, he employed several foreigners, especially of British and American origin, in various roles, both military and otherwise. Recall the doctor that I started telling you about at the beginning of this talk, throughout his kingdom. Moreover, in the very year of Choury's arrival, Kamehameha had commissioned the design of a flag for Hawaii that would unite the ensigns of Great Britain and the United States. We also have evidence that Kamehameha was specifically attentive to the symbolic efficacy of dress. The most famous example of this is his distinctive ahu'ula, or feather cloak, and if you're looking for the spelling of that word, I have it right here. And it is made almost entirely, though not exclusively, of rare yellow feathers that grew in small clusters on predominantly black mamo and o'o birds. Usually, the ahu'ula worn by ali'i, or chiefly members of Hawaiian society, were made of a combination of these yellow feathers with the more readily obtained red feathers of the i'iwi and apapane. And though there are some precedents for ahu'ula with large amounts of yellow feathers, ahu'ula literally translates as shoulder garment in red. And Kamehameha's is the only one made of nearly solid yellow, conveying his command over a network of land and people that were necessary to collect and assemble such scarce and prestigious materials. Additionally, Kamehameha had expressed his enthusiasm, you'll recall, for supporting the Russian visitors in their expedition, which he said reminded him of the British navigators Cook and Vancouver, both of whom he had met. These are not the characteristics of an individual who is going to lightly be portrayed as a, quote, discovered person, which was generally the purview of illustrated voyage accounts. I am cautious, however, of overindulging in the Kamehameha exceptionalism myth. So let me just add that Kanaka Oiwi, or Native Hawaiians, expressed knowledge of their existence within a broader world long before contact with Europeans and Euro-Americans. David Iona Cheng has argued in particular that the arrival of Cook and other Europeans did not introduce Hawaii to a world beyond its shores. Rather, it confirmed Hawaiians' long-held beliefs about their origins and reignited their curiosity about traveling the world around them. Still, exceptionality, and even when applied to a monarch, has always been part of the theorization of racial difference. Rare and exceptional individuals tend to be privileged in accounts to both prove the validity of generalizations by their deviation and to indicate the impartiality of the writer-observer. The boldness with which exceptionalism was bestowed upon Kamehameha is notable. This happened in international press coverage of Kamehameha's 1819 death, which is covered at length by Noelani Arista in her Kingdom and Republic. But it was also done at length in Shori's 1822 publication. The artist begins his picturesque voyage text by saying that he is going to offer his reader-viewers the characteristic traits and colors of people he encountered, yet the construction of a typology is most indirect in his textual description of the king, and as I've noted, undertaken a bit discrepantly, pictorially. And I want us to remember that Kamehameha was not simply a head of state whom Shori was automatically bound to show deference. Even well known as he was in 1816, Kamehameha was still a non-Christian ruler whose power was concentrated in his person and whose subject lived under what Europeans might have viewed as strict laws. And so it would have been understandable for a European writer such as Shori, publishing in France, in particular in 1822, to liken Kamehameha to the so-called Eastern despots that were much theorized by philosophers of the 18th century. Alternately, Kamehameha could have been portrayed as a Hawaiian version of Napoleon Bonaparte, the recently defeated and exiled former emperor of France, as Kamehameha had conquered his surrounding peers through martial sagacity and granted titles to those in his closest circle. And that was a characterization that took hold during later periods when it was politically expedient, for example, during a British occupation of the Hawaiian Kingdom 23 years after Kamehameha's death. The actual occupying consul described Kamehameha as a Hawaiian Bonaparte. But Shori's praise of Kamehameha and his discussion of the role that religion played in stabilizing Hawaiian politics can also be contextualized in relation to the end of the Napoleonic Wars. With these wars recently ended, monetary and naval resources were more available for exploratory voyages, and indeed Rumyantsev imagined this as a great Russian entry into the world of circumnavigation. But the memory of Napoleon also sparked conservative actions amongst the nobility of Europe. Russia entered a so-called Holy Alliance with Prussia and Austria because the monarchs of the three nations all agreed that fostering Christianity was the key to preventing future revolution in Europe. Moreover, the scholar Harry Lieberson has written about the revival of chivalric thinking in the 19th century and the ways in which Kamehameha's kingship would have appealed to writers seeking to prove after Napoleon that monarchy was in fact the most natural and stable form of social organization. As a Russian subject of German heritage publishing in France, Shori's aims for his book were ambitious and multi-layered. He had hoped that his publication would attract elite subscribers across Europe, and so dedicated the volume to the Russian Tsar, paid homage to the most prominent naturalists in Paris, and featured contributions from the Voyages naturalist who had since become the chief botanist to the Prussian court in Berlin. There will not be a quiz on these locations later. But the artist's various interests and influences pulse through his text like so many undercurrents, notably so in the section devoted to Hawaii. There, the competing interests of a conservative Russian political climate, Prussian romanticism, and French interest in comparative anatomy led to idiosyncratic pictures and textual descriptions. In several chapters, Shori shows indigenous people rendered from the hips up, set on a blank background, as I suggested to you earlier. But he only does this once in the Hawaii section, with a print entitled Woman of the Sandwich Islands, which I'm showing you at left, where I've argued that the Kamehameha portrait lacked clear and unambiguous signifiers of solely exotic origin. The so-called Woman of the Sandwich Islands at left has one prominently featured, Ale Niho Palawa, which I think Narino has in her talk later. Worn around the neck and made from a carved whale tooth strung onto a continuous rope folded many times over of human hair, this adornment would indicate that the woman is of chiefly birth. Historical accounts of the 18 teens indicate, however, that few noblewomen in 1816 would have posed for Shori without the high-collared blouse associated with European and American fashions. And in fact, Again, our friend Jean Charlot in 1958 proposed that this image at left is in fact a composite of the two at right. Perhaps the only such composite from Shori's time in Hawaii, where even his most generalized prints correspond in his text with individuals he names and meets. So Shori likely created the print of Woman of the Sandwich Islands by combining the bleached hairline, seen here, and the Leniho Palawa, seen here, of a noble woman with that of the bare torso of a woman who would have been identified with the land-tending class, in order to concentrate together a greater number of immediately palpably indigenous elements, at least to a non-familiar viewer, and to eliminate traces of European influence. Still, I would like us to note that the beaded earrings and necklace that peek out still reveal the type of cosmopolitanism that I have discussed in relation to Kamehameha. In this composite, Shori also appears to have taken the license to create a figure whose proportions and the revelation of the nude body are more in line with conventional images inspired by ancient Greek and Roman statues rather than his textual descriptions of Hawaiian women. Shori focuses most in his text on descriptions of chiefly women of Hawaii and focuses on their physical size and the darkness of their skin, especially in regard to Kamehameha's favored wife, Queen Ka'ahumanu. And as a heads up, at the end of the quotation on this slide, Shori expresses a 19th century sentiment that I think we could say is recognizably anti-Black. In this particular pictorial composition that I'm showing you right now of Queen Ka'ahumanu, Shori relies on the contrast of Ka'ahumanu with the attendant figure seated next to her in order to convey scale. And his text briefly describes her, saying Tameamea, which is one of the ways that Kamehameha's name was written in the early 19th century, has 7 wives, all of whom are aged and very large. The same is true of all the wives of the chiefs without exception. Ka'ahumanu, the one he loves best, is very large and very strong. If she were not so Black, she could pass for a beautiful woman. Shori's discussion of skin color when he describes the chiefly women bears no signs of familiarity with the famous racial classifications of Pacific Islanders from the preceding 50 years of voyage publications. Nonetheless, without making recourse to other famous racial thinkers of the time, Shori maintains the oldest and most pernicious tenet of European racial theory when he presumes that Blackness is opposed to beauty. And indeed, I would argue that it is the coupling of describing difference with aesthetic judgment that he exhibits here that brings Shori in closest alignment with the theorists of race of his time. The darker skin tone of Ka'ahumanu and other chiefly women forced Shori to perform a sort of mental acrobatics in his description of the inhabitants of Hawaii. He, like other voyagers that preceded him, was predisposed to believe that higher-ranking individuals should be paler in complexion because they toil less in the sun. He also proposed that higher-ranking members of a society should represent the least degraded, in his terms, state of a people. But in his Hawaii chapter, in order to explain the darkness of skin tone of chiefly women, Shori advances the unexpected claim that Hawaiian children were originally Black and that contact with the air and sun lightened their skin. The chiefly classes, in particular elite women, remained dark in skin tone because they were rarely outside, a theory that was completely at odds with other prominent texts on the origin of skin color at the beginning of the 19th century. The Kamehameha portrait offers a fairly indirect glimpse into Shori's promised studies of characteristic traits and colors in his chapter of Hawaii. Though the monarch is shown with skin nearly as dark in tone as his cloak, Shori altered the width of Kamehameha's face and neck when he painted over the red vest and collared shirt. And Kamehameha occupied an unusual position for Shori as both a king and potential ethnographic subject to be represented, and he largely eschews the latter in the text. But he does tell us that he had to be reminded of this unusual position while he was in Hawaii. Originally hoping to conserve paper, Shori had sketched the face of a woman who he identified as being half Hawaiian and half European on the same page as his initial sketch of Kamehameha. A British-born resident of Hawaii and a former military advisor to Kamehameha advised Shori to not show the figures together because their difference in status made the combination improper. Shori obliged, separating the sketches to observe proper deference to Kamehameha. But the result was the separation of Shori's study of racial mixing from his portrait of the monarch. And that separation is a metaphor for what Shori does throughout his chapter. He applies studies of racial difference with descriptive detail and causal conjecture, however unusual it is, largely to women, lower classes, and to an extent to the lesser chiefs, while focusing on the king as a cosmopolitan monarch and aristocrat whose race is of peripheral concern to Shori. In many ways, his chapter on Hawaii, with its moments of unorthodoxy, make manifest things that we intuitively know. 19th century ethnographic and racist theories are less coherent the more we look at them. I think I described them to Narino earlier as throwing spaghetti at a wall, though they have much more detrimental consequences. Moreover, they are always complicated by interplays of class and gender. It also reminds us, however, that Hawaii's place in 19th century global trade networks. Kamehameha's portrait is widely sought after because mercantile vessels from Russia, England, and New England relied on his ports for refreshment and trade on their way to China. The stimulated interest in Kamehameha as a person who might be described as both potentially quote-unquote savage and quote cosmopolitan, a monarch within the Pacific, and in turn Kamehameha became a kind of screen for European aristocratic projections after the fall of Napoleon. The myth of Kamehameha's exceptionalism was popularized in newspapers worldwide even before Shori's publication, generating a demand for imagery. Thus, the case of Shori and Kamehameha challenges our assumptions about the dissemination of information of foreign peoples and the primacy of print, because Shori's watercolor sketch and oil paintings that were made after it dramatically outpace the print that was published in accounts of the Russian voyage. And this might seem like an arcane note to end on, but in part it's because I want us to, even when we're working from a European perspective, to avoid flattening into mere ideas of representer and receiver. So this shift in understanding the ways in which an interest in Kamehameha also led to the circulation of non-printed works causes us to reconsider centers of knowledge production, attend to merchants and oil painters, both in Hawaii and later in Chinese trade ports, as players in the global circulation of knowledge, not merely Russian voyagers or publishers in the metropolises of Europe and the United States. Indeed, before Shori altered the initial red vest portrait in watercolor, he made a tracing of it for an American merchant, and we suspect that this tracing resembled the Bishop exemplar at center. The merchant then took the watercolor with him to China, and from there the portrait proliferated in the form of oil-painted copies. Shori describes that he came across several such copies of this red vest portrait when he arrived with the Russian voyage in the Philippines. Moreover, an oil copy painted in China, so that was the third one here, was gifted to the Boston Athenaeum before the Russian voyage had even returned home. So ultimately, this red vest version of the portrait had a far wider distribution than Shori's cloaked version. It has been recopied numerous times. I have seen it used as a banner of local Hawaiian civic clubs even to this day. And at far right, we have an oil painting from 1850 that today hangs in Iolani Palace in Honolulu, to which Kamehameha's trademark yellow feather ahu'ula has been added. Indeed, it's perhaps the most commensurate mantle to drape over this red vest. Thank you.
And to introduce our third speaker is Hannah Thompson, MA candidate in art history at UC Davis.
Thank you. Our next and final speaker is Dr. Ellis, Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Auckland, New Zealand. Dr. Ellis's primary field of research is Māori art history with a focus on identifying, promoting, and recuperating mātauranga in relation to art forms, art practices, artists, and theories. Her work disseminates Māori-centered methodologies, terminologies, and research in relation to art history across a broad range of audiences. Her newest project, Nanga Tuanga o Wharawhara, The Worlds of Maori Body Adornment, brings together oral, tonga, and archival research into the ceremonial, political, and economic roles in Maori communities. We are honored to be one of her many audiences today, and she will be sharing with us her paper entitled Tuanga Paraoa, Tuanga Pacifica, Tuanga Maori, Tracing the Ancestors Through Maori Art History. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Ellis.
Uia mai koe a whakahua te ake, ko wai te whare nei e, ko te kani, ko wai te ko keirunga, ko paikea, ko paikea. Ko te tauho tōku kōka, ko hukurangi te maunga ko waiapu te awa, ko tai rāwhiti me ohina waiapu ngā marae, ko ngai tāne me te whānau takimona ngā hapū, ko Ngāti Porou te iwi. Arā, ko te tauho tōku koro, ko rākau mangamanga te maunga, ko epipiri te moana, ko te rāwhiti te marae, ko Ngāti Kuta te hapū, ko Ngāpuhi te iwi. Ko au e tūnei, ko ngā tāpirino te poko whataparao mihi nei kia koutou. Ki ngā tangata whenua o tēnei rohe e mahi ana, ko ngā iwi o Patwin, kei te mihi kia koutou. Ki ngā rangatira o tēnei wānanga, kia Michael Yonan, me Alan Templeton, kei te mihi. Ki oku hua hou, ko Jen, Stacey me Kailani, ngā mihi aroha kia koutou. Kia koutou katoa no ngā hau e whā, kua hui mai nei hei whakawhiti whakaro i tēnei ahi. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Hello everyone, when I say this to my stage one students, they think it's some super sacred knowledge that I'm imparting on those who might be able to understand te reo Māori. It's not, it is just explaining who I am, where I'm from. I'm from a tribe on the East Coast. These are my meeting houses. I'm from a tribe in the Bay of Islands called Ngāpuhi, and these are my grandparents. I always have my grandparents with me. I started today's talk with part of a haka, now usually performed as a waiata, a song, which is known as the Ngāti Porou tribal anthem. We come from the east coast of the North Island and are the second largest tribe in the country with 70,000 members. Starting with a haka is appropriate for this week, when at home we celebrate our national kapahaka performing arts competition, Te Matatini in Auckland, where at least 30,000 will attend over 4 days and watch groups compete for trophies and awards. Today, the top 12 perform, including one cousin and 2 nieces. The haka was originally written for the opening of a meeting house in the 1860s and describes various features of the architecture. Most importantly for today's talk, the song talks about our tipuna, our ancestor Paikea, who travelled from Hawaii, our ancestral homeland in the Pacific, to Aotearoa on the back of a whale, or according to other stories, as a whale. And if you're interested in more, that's my first book. In some Indigenous cultures, this would make us, as Ngāti Porou, whale people. Our Pacific ancestors brought with them a reverence for whales when they travelled to Aotearoa. This came in the physical form of the treasures, what we call taonga tukuiho, which were made from whale bone and teeth. The value of whales was also brought in their minds, in their practices, their karakia, their prayers, and their ways of making. My talk today explores how we as Māori use whalebone and teeth in our art, and specifically in our adornment. I will show how Māori art history provides specific methods and terminologies with which to learn about them, and I will argue that this can impact other Indigenous and non-Indigenous art histories. So let us begin. Stories about whales, and you'll notice I use lots of family photos. So this is my mother, Elizabeth, and this is her brother cousin. We've all got brother cousins. Uncle Matu at Te Rāwhiti Marae, and this was last November. Stories about whales have shaped many tribal histories. These begin in the Pacific. We make these connections when we introduce ourselves. My Uncle Matu, who is from my northern tribe of Ngāpuhi, uses these words in his formal mihi when introducing himself. Rākau mangamanga te tiro ki Rapanui, Easter Island. Rapanui te tiro ki Tapuatea, Rangiatea, Tahiti. Tapuatea te tiro ki Rākau mangamanga. Ko tēnei te tapatoru o te Poronehana, the Polynesian Triangle. Uncle Matu connects out from our ancestral mountain of Rākaumanga in the eastern Bay of Islands to Rapanui, Easter Island in the east, and then to Tahiti in the north. He is tracing our whakapapa, our genealogy, back into the Pacific. We can trace our ancestors' voyages also through the art that they made. In the Pacific, whalebone and teeth were highly prized and symbolised mana, or power, and prestige. In Fiji, sperm whale teeth were made into tambua and presented on important life occasions such as births, weddings and funerals, and they're still very highly regarded and used for these same ceremonies today. Other Fijian artists made whale teeth into wā seka and composite breastplates, as well as the necklaces of smaller teeth, made from smaller teeth. In Tonga, whale teeth were sometimes carved into small female figures that were worn by chiefly women to symbolise their status. This remarkable example from England, now in England, has 8 of these beautiful figures. And up in Hawaii, artists made the remarkable Leiniho Palawa, shaping sperm whale's teeth into a hooked form and threading a multitude of plaited strands made from human hair through them. These were only worn by high-ranking men and women. This reverence for whale's teeth by our Pacific ancestors was brought to Aotearoa, New Zealand, where the material was made into a range of different treasures. The earliest examples were small and portable, so they could be easily carried by our ancestors as they scoped out the new terrain. Rei niho are distinct with their chevrons and notched edging. This example is very Pacific in its styling, with the figure at the end, and you can't quite see because it's a pretty bad image, but down the end on the left-hand side is a figure standing like this, and it has a direct relevance to the figure up the top there, which was initially thought to be from the Austral Islands, but new research has revealed it's actually from Tahiti. Other small pieces of whalebone and teeth were made into smaller units and drilled at the top to be worn as a multi-unit necklace. This style was replaced around 1500 by a large central tooth surrounded by several smaller reels. Whale's teeth were so rare in some areas that stone was used to replicate this central form, hollowed out, of course, because of the weight. Whalebone was used to make heru, or combs, worn by men and women. Those made from whalebone were highly prized, and due to the rarity of the material, only usually worn by chiefly people in their top knots. As they were associated with the head, our most sacred part of the body, they were also tapu and could not be worn by other people. The last most important adornment made from sperm whale teeth was the reiputa. This is my twin sister on the left. She's looking after our kids this week. I'm here with my husband, Nepia. These taonga were shaped sperm whale teeth, which featured a semblance of a face at one end and a series of suspension holes at the other. They were very, very rare. My sister and I were writing an article together. She's got a different day job, but we did art history together back in the day, so we're writing it together. We've found around 40 examples, none in the US. The US, for your information, has 524 taonga, which are adornments, compared to 4,414 in museums globally. Fun fact of the day, there will not be a quiz. Oh, hang on. These taonga parawa, or treasures made from sperm whales, were part of a wider culture of veneration of whales. This respect was recorded in wood carvings on the pātaka, or raised storehouse. On the maihi, where's the pointer? Which is this, oh, it's not going. The part that goes down on the side there, the barge boards, you can see a whale being dragged onto the shore by figures which are all the way up. These pātaka, these buildings, were raised storehouses with extensive carving on the exterior and that were the most decorated architectural structure in the village. The meeting house that we have today didn't evolve until the 1840s and replaced pātaka as the most carved building. The beaching of a whale meant a time of abundance for the local people who used every part of the mammal. Their blubber would be used for food. So my grandfather, who you saw, he would have that when he was a child. The oil was used for painting both wood and people. Whale teeth was made into adornments, and whale bones were transformed into weapons such as the prestigious hoeroa on the far right and the patuprawa in the middle, which is a one-handed cleaver. The whale's raw materials could also be traded with other tribes. Whales were also referenced with the use of a carved surface design called taratara a kai. The wriggly lines, as you can see here on the body and the side of this figure, recall the crooked teeth of our ancestor Kai, who stole a beloved pet whale, then killed and ate him. Its owner, Tiniro, got revenge, only identifying the culprit by his wiggly teeth. I'm looking at these adornments as part of a wider project called Ngā Taonga o Wharawhara, the Treasures of Wharawhara. I'm examining one particular form of Māori art, adornment, for a forthcoming book with Te Papa Press. It's particularly exciting to find practices that we haven't done for many generations, such as the use of feathers pushed through the septum or the spectacle of wearing a live bird in the ear until it dies. It shows just how experimental our ancestors were. And so on the left-hand side from 1844, you see this woman has whole bird wings covering her head, and Tukukino on the right has a whole huia bird which died out around the turn of the 20th century, which has been pushed through his ear as the ultimate form of adornment. I'm also looking at how gender in particular was not constrained as it would be later in the 19th century. And in particular, these photos were taken when most other Māori women were growing their hair long. Traditionally, we had our hair cut short as women. We cut it as a sign of mourning. The Wharawhara project itself is part of a career-long goal of advocating for a Māori art history. This is more than popping the word Māori in front of art history or including a few usually traditional pieces of Māori art in a survey course. It means dismantling the discipline as taught and written about today at its core and pushing back on the pitch that often states that art history began with Vasari in Italy talking about his mates. We, as Māori art historians, and we are very few, argue that we have been thinking and critiquing art for many generations. So these are the papers, most of the papers that I teach into. On Monday, I'm starting the paper on the far right, where the students are only allowed to read Indigenous writers. They're not allowed to read anyone else in terms of museum studies. And on Tuesday morning, I'm starting teaching art crime. Our curators are the tohunga, or the specialists, and others who chose how our works might be displayed. These displays are our exhibitions, where our curators would use a visual language to talk about concepts such as power and land. Our patrons are the chiefs who commissioned artists to make new works of art. Māori art history uses concepts and values drawn from our own culture. Let me introduce a few. Tapu is the sacredness of our artworks and practices. We recognise taonga tuku iho, our ancestral treasures, as living beings named with care after ideas and people. Tapu can look like karakia or prayers said by artists before starting work to ensure the spiritual safety of all involved. It is the care taken with materials that are harvested and stored respectfully. It is making sure highly tapu art practices are undertaken in sites where there is no food, such as moko or incised designs on the skin. Mana is the prestige given to the artworks. Sometimes this is due to the type of art form, such as carving or weaving. Sometimes it is who is depicted or where it is placed. Kōrero are the stories that surround the artwork or practice. These are generated by the artists as well as those who revolve around them and their work. It is the passing down of knowledges orally, which are then embedded in physical artworks. Whenua is the land from which the materials come. This concept remembers that whenua is also our word for afterbirth, which is buried in our earth, to connect the new generation with ones gone by. But probably the most central to my own practice as a Māori art historian is the concept of whakapapa. Whakapapa is a way in which we make connections across the generations, but to art history we relate this to contextual methodologies, where we link the artwork in relation to people, places, and events. The idea of whakapapa also relates to Arjun Appadurai's concept of a biography of an object. In this framing, any object has a distinct life, in that it has a specific beginning and end, and in between there are events and people and ideas associated with them. All these concepts are part of this wider, ever-moving network called Māori art history. Our methodologies prioritise using a broad range of sources. Not only do we look at texts and drawings and of course the art itself, but we also prioritise examining oral sources. Our ancestors recorded their art histories in whakatauki, which are proverbs, waiata songs, haka performance, karakia prayers, karanga calls of welcome. For adornment, these kinds of accounts shed new light on the role of materials, for instance, such as feathers or red ochre. We learn about the names of specific adornments and their roles in shaping the communities in which they circulated. Māori art history recognises mana wahine, or the value of women. Their art forms, their voices, their practices have been sidelined often by our own men over the past 200 years. We see how Māori ideas of gender and sexuality have been misaligned and suppressed through the imposition of European gender hierarchies. And new research by art historians such as Ngāhui Te Awe Kōtaku, who is my first PhD advisor, is resurrecting the important perspectives of takatapui and their retelling of history, and takatapui is LGBTQI+. Māori art history reminds readers that Europe, and especially England, is not the centre of the universe. Non-Indigenous researchers often presume that readers will know who Captain Cook is, and that the West is always in Europe. Yet many of our nieces and nephews have no idea who Cook is and are not interested. And I always think of the West personally as Taranaki, an area to the west of our North Island, not to Europe. We as Māori art historians encourage the use of the word I to make us distinct in our writing, as our research is always personal. I am not Paul from Parnell, which is an upper socioeconomic suburb in Auckland. I am Ngārino from Ngāpuhi and Ngātipuro. This shapes everything that I do as an art historian. With this in mind, let us look at a couple of taonga praoa, one from each of my tribes, to see how Māori art history operates. This is our ancestor Te Kuku. He is the son of a chief of the Ngāti Raumati people whose ancestral mountain is Rākau Mangamanga in the Bay of Islands, which I showed at the start of the talk. This portrait was drawn in late 1769 by Sydney Parkinson, the official artist on James Cook's first voyage. We see him dressed in full regalia. He has a whalebone comb in his hair. He has a greenstone long drop in his ear with the teeth of his parents and grandparents in his at the top. He's wearing a reiputa. He has a whalebone ore or pin holding his cloak together. He also has a very, very unusual and specific type of moko on his face and lines going down his forehead. Te Kuku's people had a strong art culture, with Joseph Banks, Cook's botanist, describing seeing many large carved canoes, as well as greenstone and whalebone cleavers and whalebone long staffs. Many also had extensive moko, like he has on his face. While Parkinson here has shown a sedate young man dressed formally, in reality, Te Kuku was nursing a wound to his thigh that he had received on Motuarohia Island on the afternoon of the 30th of November 1769. And my uncle Matu, who I showed at the start, that's where he was born and raised. He received this injury as he and 600 met a hungry and thirsty cook and his boys on the local beach. They had performed a haka to show Cook their mana, but as some of them moved forward, they were shot at, and wisely they retreated. Remarkably, or maybe still not unremarkably, Cook still wanted to trade. He found a group, including Te Kuku and his brother, who were sheltering/hiding in a cave. He reassured him that the wound would heal, but in the meantime, could they please give them food and water? This drawing was made at that time. Cook also traded for all the taonga that Te Kuku was wearing that day, which marked him out his mana and his tapu. All 5 treasures that we see here today were whisked away and are currently in the British Museum. I wonder how Cook was able to persuade Te Kuku to part with these most precious of adornments. When I look at this drawing, I also think about how we might frame this looking in terms of whenua, land, and mana. During the time of Te Kuku's children, their land was invaded by a group from the northern Bay of Islands that included my ancestor, Te Nana. Te Kuku's people were killed and dispersed or intermarried with the newcomers. The drawing of Te Kuku also invokes the idea of whakapapa, of genealogy, and how cultural heritage institutions today are seeking out new relationships with Indigenous communities. In 2018, I was privileged to meet him at the British Library following a request for engagement from our people at Te Rāwhiti. My cousin Anya was our contact and said that actually her cousin was coming to England soon and would be able to visit. And so when I went in and met him, and here I am supported by members of Ngāti Rānana, which is the Māori group based in England, particularly Auntie Esther to my left. When I went in and saw the drawing, it was very powerful actually. I got very tearful because I didn't see him as a drawing. I saw him as a person, and particularly as a tūpāpaku, which is someone who has passed away. We have open coffins in our culture. And so I did what I'd just been learning about, which is te karanga, which is a call to him, explaining who I was. Oof, sort yourself out, okay. Explaining who I was, and at the end of that, I sang our song that we sing that was composed by Uncle Matu's father, describing Te Rāwhiti and Rākau Mangamanga. And so for me, as a Māori art historian, this drawing is more than paper and pencil. It is Te Kuku. From the Bay of Islands, we move now 12 hours drive southeast to the east coast to meet another heru iwi, or whalebone comb. This example belonged to a man called Te Kani a Takiro, the chief of Te Aitanga Hauiti, a tribe on this North Island. He was so sacred, so tapu, that Te Kani a Takiro never grew his own food and always travelled with a security team. The haka that I started this talk with was composed for the opening of this particular meeting house, which reinforced his mana and whakapapa. Often our taonga are named after the person who wore them, as is the case with this one. As with Te Kuku's comb, it is unclear how his most personal and tapu comb made its way to England and into the collection of the British Museum. By the time Te Kaneā Takiero died in the 1850s, Māori art was going through rapid changes. Within a single decade, the pātaka carved storehouse and whalebone and teeth were set aside as primary symbols of mana. In their place, the meeting house and greenstone emerged as the most significant visual manifestations of identity. By the 1850s anyway, whalebone was in short supply. The whales we had harvested after they had beached themselves were no longer around due to the huge commercial whaling industry that had been active for over 50 years. Whalers from Australia and the US and elsewhere caught and processed hundreds of whales each year for overseas markets. In the Bay of Islands alone, hundreds of whaling ships called into the main port of Kororareka or Russell every year, peaking in 1840. At the same time as fewer whales being available, intertribal warfare had enabled increasing access to greenstone from the South Island, and so taonga like Reiputa was set aside. In the late 20th century, museums began opening their basements for Māori to engage with ancestral treasures once more. Contemporary Māori artists in particular visited for new inspiration and learnt about old styles and techniques not made for many generations. There was increasing access to sperm whale bone and teeth through the regulation from the government through our Department of Conservation. Tribes apply for licences to harvest these materials from whales who have died naturally on shore, just like our ancestors did. They make, once again, rei niho and especially rei puta. The practice of these contemporary adornment artists reminds us of the cyclic nature of Māori art. Their learnings from others, their visits to museums, their experimentation with different materials and techniques, and increasingly their engagement with Indigenous cousins is valuable and reinforces the tenacity of artists to keep making through the traumas of colonisation. Our world of Māori art history is still taking shape. Deirdre Brown and I are currently completing the final painful publication stages for our 12-year project, Toi Te Mana, an Indigenous history of Māori art from Aotearoa, New Zealand, which is due out later this year with Auckland University Press. This is our version of events, and we hope will encourage other Indigenous art historians to use the language, ideas and sources from their own communities to shape the way they tell their art history. It is heavy work, but rewarding when we see just how marvellous our art history is and how it continues to reverberate across communities globally. This is my family, my two grandparents there. These are some of their descendants. There's like 100. So yes, the Māori world is forever turning. In the past 3 weeks in New Zealand, we have experienced firsthand the impact of climate change with unprecedented levels of rain, then a cyclone last week, and today again they are experiencing severe thunderstorms. People have died, homes have been destroyed, communities isolated. Māori have felt this acutely, and our tribes have set about mobilising to help each other out. So what is the role of Māori art history in all this? How can it address some of the most pressing issues in our communities today? I'm sure I'm not the only Indigenous art historian to wrangle with these thoughts. My response is that our work can demonstrate that through trauma, our art forms and practices have survived in the past, and they can continue to provide a space to reflect and come together. Our people have drawn strength from the ongoing presence of our decorated meeting houses, for instance, some of which have recently been destroyed by storms, but others which have provided a place of refuge for those, both Māori and non-Māori, are caught in these events. At the end of the day, it is all about people. He aha te mea nui, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. What is the greatest thing? It is people, it is people, it is people. Kia ora koutou.
And to provide a response to our three talks, I would like to introduce Dr. Jennifer Wagley. Dr. Wagley earned her PhD at the Graduate Center of CUNY and is currently academic liaison at the Manetti Shrem Museum here at UC Davis, a position she holds after appointments at the Eskenazi Museum of Art at Indiana University and the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Her area of study is the art of the Pacific, especially Maori art and material culture. With Professor Bridget Cooks of UC Irvine, she is co-editor of Mannequins in Museums, Power and Resistance on Display, published by Routledge in 2021, and her research also encompasses the history of museums, collections, and exhibitions. So, welcome.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, everyone, for being here. This is just enormously gratifying to see all these wonderful faces. It is, of course, my pleasure to serve in this role, one that is impossible in many ways. But I would like to, of course, thank Michael for his very generous introduction, and of course to the amazing art history graduate students who pushed for this topic. And of course, I'd like to thank Alan Templeton for his support of this yearly event, which so deeply enriches our campus community. And of course, I want to thank my wonderful colleagues, Dr. Ellis, Dr. Polzak, and Dr. Kamahiro, for making their way to Davis, California, to grace us with this incredible work. I am actually going to frame my response to today's paper with a quote from my own mentor, the anthropologist and curator of oceanic ethnography at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, Adrian Kepler, who passed away just a little under a year ago. In describing the aesthetic traditions of the Pacific, she has written, "Art as a separable category has little meaning in an analysis of traditional Polynesian culture. Polynesian languages do not have indigenous words or concepts for art. Thus, to place Polynesian art in a meaningful perspective, we must define art broadly. In Polynesia, the arts encompass all cultural forms that result from creative processes that use or manipulate words, sounds, movements, materials, spaces, or scents in such a way that they formalize the informal. Aesthetics can then be defined as a culturally specific, evaluative ways of thinking about such forms." With that in mind, I believe that when a scholar endeavors to study the Pacific, it is a unique undertaking within the history of art. Of course, there is the vastness that we've referred to many, many times now of the area itself, covering a third of the world's surface and containing 25,000 islands inhabited by an estimated 25 million people. But more so, as a relatively new area of study for art historians, there is a freedom in choosing where your scholarship will focus, as so much is uncharted, while there's also what you would almost call, I don't know, a duty in a way, not to get Pirates of Penzance on us all, but a duty of some kind to your scholarship because it centers on uncovering and returning a history back to its owners, to the ancestors, and that is not a responsibility to be taken lightly. These are some of the things that I think about a lot as an American art historian working in a place that is not my own culture. And how do I tread in those waters? And I don't know how to put it, but how do I help? How do I contribute? These are all things that you think about. So in these three papers presented today, you've been witness to what I believe are really the cream of the crop. These are scholars who are unwavering in their academic rigor, their intellectual curiosity, and their cultural acuity. While the tie that binds the work of all three is the Pacific, it is their methodology of making sense of the world through a close examination of objects and historical context, and doing so from both the outside in and the inside out. Getting into the papers themselves, I will just briefly summarize, no big deal, what has been an incredibly generative series of talks so that we can get quickly to the questions, right? But getting into the papers themselves, Stacy Kamahiro has presented us with this remarkable world tour by David Kalakaua, the monarch of the Hawaiian Kingdom from 1874 to 1891. It is with a certain kind of awe that I learned, and we all learned, I think, about his meticulous strategy in dress, in exchange, in gift, that both kept ties to his homeland through the kalo, through all the various forms that it took, while also presenting subtle and not so subtle signifiers of royal orders. Really a remarkable revelation in so many ways about this incredible voyage that Kalakaua made. Now, Stacy's work is a perfect precursor to the work of Kailani Polzak, who focused on the 18th century and deftly laid out the impact of European perceptions of the Pacific in the construction of racial difference, further bolstered by the field of art history itself and its own contributions to racial difference, while also, I think, a call to arms for art historians of what art history can do for the field and different from other disciplines. Her reading of Chure's portrait of Kamehameha reveals a very uncomfortable relationship between the unwritten rules of illustrators aboard scientific expeditions, as well, and coupled with the early ingrained notions of what the Hawaiian monarchy should look like. And through this work, she's reinforced Hawaii as a major player in global trade networks at the time, Kamehameha's self-perception as a cosmopolitan ruler, and finally, it details the interplay between class and gender and the construction of Hawaiian race. And finally, Narino Ellis's paper, which so beautifully encapsulates all of the work presented today. I've heard Narino give papers before, and wow, right? I'm just so thrilled to I feel like I'm just sharing all of these wonderful gifts, all of these wonderful people I know, and I'm so glad that you get to know this incredible area of scholarship that I have been so humbled and graced to be a part of. But Narino, she of course spoke about her whakapapa, perhaps my favorite concept in all of the world, and the connections that we have with people and family, and how that fuels and informs the work that she does. She talking about the highly valued material of whalebone and providing us with a very rich understanding of how Maori communities drew on their knowledge of that material as their culture emerged in the 1500s, highlighting these beautiful carved adornments. I mean, has anyone ever seen anything as beautiful as that necklace, the Hawaiian necklace with I just can't even. Anyway, but she's demonstrated the importance of whalebone that transcends cultures and politics and economies, and presenting to us the world of Maori art history, and as a source all its own. That these objects have distinct lives. In returning to Adrian Kepler's quote, all three of these papers have, of course, demonstrated a remarkable understanding of this broad term, right? And in Polynesia, and how in Polynesia this can be understood. These are the scholars that are the next generation. What you are looking at, what you have heard, is a move forward in this scholarship that is not looking at these works of art and these objects through a European perspective. It is looking at these works, encouraging new scholarship that is firmly planted in an indigenous lens. I've been thinking about it, how to end my response, and one of the things that I want to push on is I hope that this opens doors for conversation, especially during this reception that we're having afterwards. And FYI, the galleries are going to be open till 7, so please go into the galleries. But perhaps during the reception, it can offer a opportunity for conversation about what our next steps are. How do we get this work out to more people? How do we bring this more to UC Davis, where there are no Pacific scholars to speak of, in a way? I would like to point to Stacy Kamahiro and Kailani Polzak at UC Santa Cruz, who is very, very smart in providing this incredible opportunity for students to learn from them. At this point, Stacy, correct me if I'm wrong, but at this moment, there is only one place in the United States that you can receive a PhD in art history supervised by an art historian trained in the Pacific. One place. That's with these two. Yeah. Well, and then, I know, this could be outdated, but I do believe you're the only Maori person teaching art history in a New Zealand university at this moment, correct? Yeah. So we need to do something about that. And I think that the enthusiasm of this crowd and this moment is something that we can't let go of. So I encourage a broader conversation on our campus, in engaging with our Pacific students and our Pacific communities that are so much a part of Northern California, of my own museum, to here at UC, or as a contemporary art museum, to display the work of contemporary Pacific artists. And I hope that this opens a lot of doors for all of us. So with that, I'm so grateful for your presentations. I'm so grateful to be a part of this today. And with that, I would like to invite the three of you up to the stage. I think there's a student or somebody's going to run the mic. Great. And we'll get some questions. And Michael, are you going to come back up? Great. So thanks, everyone.
And we welcome questions from the audience today. Where did Hunter go? I just lost her.
A lot of attrition.
Oh, there she is.
That's good. Just kidding.
Yes, let's start here with Hegnar Wattenpaul, professor.
Thank you all. Oh, thank you so much.
We had one.
It's not on. Anyway.
Just shout it out, Hagner.
Okay. Thank you so much for these amazing papers and this wonderful comment. And thank you, Jennifer, for remembering Adrienne Kepler, who was my teacher. I was honored to study Pacific art with her, though I don't work on Pacific art, but studying with her transformed the way I think about art history. And I think all three of these talks showed the methodological and theoretical insights that you have gained in studying the Pacific, that those of us who study other types of art in other places have so much to learn from. So since we are a department that emphasizes research and fieldwork, I was wondering if you could reflect, each of you, on the kinds of fieldwork challenges or source challenges that you face as art historians of the Pacific. Where are your archives? How do you create your own archive and you uncover archives that are not even considered archives? So if you could reflect on that, that would be great. Thank you.
I'll start. Thanks so much for the question. It's a really important question in terms of trying to develop an archive, because it's not like you can just, there's all the material you want in a box that you just what I find myself doing is trying to reconstruct. There really never really was a Hawaiian art history anyway, There's a lot of anthropology, and so you're kind of looking at anthropological archives. But for me, it's been a lot of digging. And you're looking maybe at tons and tons of missionary journals to find maybe the 2 or 3 sentences that might describe something that was being made by a native Hawaiian person, and then trying to cobble that together. So, it's really in sort of these peripheral places that you can find this information, then try to start centering it so that it forms the basis of something. And they're all over. And then the archives, of course, themselves, at least in Hawaii, were primarily put together by the folks who overthrew the native government and established a provisional government, and then sought to will try to get annexed by the United States. So it reflects a different perspective of what was saved, what was organized, how it was organized, and it's definitely, it really takes a lot of patience, I think, to really go through those materials to then excavate out what some of these other indigenous, perspectives could have been. And then there's other things that are scattered. Right now, I think one of the problems too is people focus on Honolulu, and I do think that there are some really interesting unknown things out in the outer islands that people haven't really focused on. And I think that needs more attention as well. So that's just a start, but yeah.
Is that your next work?
Yeah, I know, right? I mean, just like, yeah, it's a lifetime's work.
You go next.
Well, I'm the European specialist of the group, right? So I think part of it is thinking expansively about what my archives are, and I don't want to make this answer too long, but I think if I don't want to simply always rely on the British Library or like the French archives of the Defense Ministry, I also think about, well, where else am I looking for information? So you didn't see it in this talk, but I have another talk where I'm talking about Kealakekua Bay in particular, and also the representation of coastal profiles. And so I thought, well, in addition to looking at works by like Weber on Captain Cook's third voyage, I also looked to Mele Ko'ihonua, sorry, long day, Ko'ihonua, that described the arrival of Hawaiians to the Pai'aina, the archipelago of Hawaii, and thinking about how it offered a view of islands rising from the darkness of the ocean, and that might also be an imagistic source, if not pictorial source, that I could put up against a European text. So for me, my travel with archives is less challenging and sometimes better indexed than what Stacey faces, but it's not, I think for me the task is not allowing that facility to sort of dull the task I set for myself as a researcher.
In terms of my research, my research and Toitumana starts in Te Pō, which is before the separation of Rangi and Papa, goes right up to today. And my sources are, as I talked about, all over the place. So some of them are in museums, and museums are increasingly welcoming. Not always, but generally, I think. But they're also in archives, they're also in art galleries, and just as importantly, they are going out talking to people, talking to artists, talking to kuia and kaumātua elders, which people usually don't do in terms of art history. It's quite hard in terms of my area because there's so few of us practicing it and practicing for what people would say. And so Ngā Huia was there. I was in her first class in 88 when she first taught Māori art history, and she's actually the reason I'm here and not as a lawyer, because she had offered me something. And so it's about different projects requiring different focuses. And so archives and museums are great, looking at the old taonga and thinking about how rare it is for people to go and see them, but it's also important to go and take your research back and to talk to people. I mean, having a feed and at a hui at a some kind of event is just as rewarding in terms of talking about material and learning about material as going into an archive for me anyway. Kia ora.
Thank you. I was blown away by these presentations. And I methodologically and in terms of content, you bring up a perspective that undermines art history itself and its methods and its histories. And so I'm curious about how could your work challenge the mainstream concept of nationalism because of its vastness and of its fragmentation. And literally, the nation state is based on a boundary that is limited. So, and when you just showed the map, this kind of fragmentation and vastness that goes against every kind of art historical method and thinking. So how does this body of work from the margin change and challenge the mainstream? And how does this fragmentation and vastness actually impact the way you think about art history?
Well, I hope that we're all undermining art history, because if we don't, it's a dead discipline. You know, if it was keeping going the way that I was taught when I started uni, we wouldn't, you know, it would be frankly really boring, and it would still be the idea of the textbooks. You know, I mean, what's happening now is this kind of new art history is exactly how we as Indigenous art historians have been practicing forever. We go and talk to people, and we think about the Pacific in terms of its vastness, but also that Sea of Islands concept, that it's not so vast, that actually we are connected through whakapapa, which is, for me, is for everything. And at Auckland, we're pushing back on this idea of a single narrative of art history, and it's still very contentious with many people because they think, oh, it's about, you know, you've got to start with Vasari. No, you don't actually. And it's about really kind of being the naughty kids and trying to really advocate for individual kind of art histories from different cultures, and even within Māori culture, there are 50 tribes. So how I practice in terms of being Ngāpuhi will be different from being Ngāti Porou and so forth. And to have that texture and that difference is the way of the future. We have to kind of really push back on all of those ideas that are pushed so hard in art history about visual analysis and using certain words and certain methods, because that doesn't describe the world that we know that we were raised in. It doesn't describe the world that we live in now, and it can't describe the future. And we're all facing as departments declining numbers, where they're being pushed towards other types of disciplines, and we have to change if we want to stay relevant, you know, and our work has to be political. It has to, or else we're just not, it's, the discipline has to be interdisciplinary as well. We have to relate. I relate to Māori historians because there's no one else who's teaching in my field. You know, I relate to others in Māori studies because there's no one else in my field. You have to make these connections, and ultimately it's about being Indigenous.
I was sort of thinking about it in terms of I was thinking about Kalakaua's period and this idea of contracting and expanding, and how both, it was sort of a pulse, you know, that he both needed the nation and this idea of the state, although it was an artificial imposition to need that sort of thing to protect himself, but also ventured beyond it, like, you know, thinking about whakapapa, thinking about genealogical connections, having conversations with the leaders of Japan and China and, you know, Siam, to understand how are we related and how can we help each other. For me, I'm sort of thinking in that he sets a good model for us to, you know, not create these firm boundaries and become sort of, I don't know, like just overly rigid in thinking about things. Understanding that things need to keep moving, like you said, they need to keep changing in order to stay relevant. And I think it was a good model, and it sets a good tone for our work in the future as well.
Yeah, I think back to what Narino said a little while ago, which is that every project sort of demands different things of you, and being attentive to that. And I think as a person who works on 18th and 19th century Europe, a time where there was great confidence in the ability to classify and to organize the world, resisting that impulse and recognizing how messy that impulse was, I think is sort of my task, which is somewhat different. And so when I'm looking at European voyages in the Pacific, I don't endeavor to flatten every single place that Shori visited and be able to say something about, you know, like the North Pacific, you know, through the lens of Shori, because there are so many differences of encounter of people of worldview that I think get often sort of lumped and classified. Like even whenever I hear the discussion of Kalakaua using the term Malay, right? Like that is out of like early 19th century racial classifications, right? Of grouping the world into 5 different parts. And so I think I am forever, and I'm the one who does the most visual analysis of everybody, right? Like I spend a long time in my talk just making you look at one picture, right? So like I am truly, in many ways, still in old art history, but also thinking about, well, like what is it that we get out of it? How do we engage in that kind of looking without putting too many of our eggs in the empirical basket, because we have to be suspicious about the ways in which our modes of looking are conditioned. And so I think that attending to the possibilities of whakapapa mo'oku auhao in the Pacific, but also specificity, it always calls me away from engaging in the sort of classificatory impulse.
Any further questions?
I've got a question of my own, but I'm
Yes,
holding
you
my...
have the mic.
Awesome.
So in terms of being educators, for me, when I think often about how I got my start in art history, it's so rooted in history itself and my experiences in my history classes that informed me enough to be able to participate more meaningfully in discussions of art history. But it sounds as if, but it sounds as if that is a kind of continuing thread throughout all of your papers, was the importance of history. You cannot be without that, despite times in art history where they would very much like to do without and just look at the object, but the importance of the moment in which it is existing, being created, talked about throughout time. And I was wondering if you are seeing in history classes if there is difficulty because there is not a rooting in these history classes that students will often take to cover your areas. Do you feel as if you have to do a lot of legwork in covering history, therefore kind of becoming both art historian and historian in the senses of like full disciplines, if that makes sense?
Well, I wasn't trained in history and I'm not interested in history as a discipline. I'm trained in art history. I came into the university when I started. I'd never done art history, I'd only done art, and this was the closest thing because my dad taught at the art school. I didn't want to be down with Dad and his mates. History is important, but it's about how you frame it and whether art history and history are often kind of brought together, but I think art history needs to be seen as quite separate, and I find that history actually is turning more, if you look at the books, towards art history. They're including images, they're including objects, they're including so many things, and why is that? And so I kind of say to my mates who are Māori historians in our group, Pohere Koro, I said, you guys are all art historians because you keep including my stuff in all your talks. You have images, whereas in all mine, I don't include text. So I think breaking down those disciplines and saying that going forward, we can actually learn from each other and think, well, I do art history, but I also do anthropology. I don't like anthropology, but, I do kind of what people would say is anthropology. I do sociology, and really breaking down those boundaries because it's really important to do so that we remain relevant, so that students keep coming to us and go, well, I didn't realise that that's what they did. Yeah, so shifting away and not putting us all together all the time. Mm.
Well, I love history. And I do think it's really important to help us understand where we're going. And I think one of the things that always sort of bothered me was that when you see a lot of the sort of status quo narratives about what happened to this king or what happened to the Hawaiian monarchy, it was just kind of the same thing over, but it just didn't kind of make any sense. It really didn't make any sense. Like, how did it actually happen? Who was really active, right? So it becomes like, well, whose history is actually being told? from whose perspective. And so it's being very important then if you're going to shape where you're going, you really have to go back and say, well, do we need to think about another perspective's history in order to shape where that's going? So there's all this talk about like indigenous futurities right now. And I feel like that's kind of what Kalakaua was doing back then, right? He was really shaping a future in the 19th century. And he was telling certain stories, and he was doing things a certain way. And he wasn't the only one. I mean, he's sort of one person that I think stands out for me that I became really interested in. And I think that too is a model, kind of going back to that, for what we can do today is like, what stories do we look at as we try to shape a future that we want to have? And if we rely on old stories that don't include certain people or certain voices, then that's not going to happen as we move forward either, right? So, and I think, with going back to the archive question, you do have to rely on histories from various perspectives and put them into conversation with each other, not simply get rid of one and replace it with another, but understand the intricacies between the dialogues that were happening. Life was complicated, it's never been simple, and to kind of oversimplify it into one particular indigenous voice versus one particular settler voice, when we know people were like very intermingled. I mean, look at what the king was doing, right? So I'd like to take it also with a lot of nuance and complexity and understand all of these uncertainties, and sort of not knowing where things would go. A lot of these were built on hopes of where things might go. So keeping that sort of in mind as well as we look at those histories. So I'm sort of rambling at this point, but yeah, but that's kind of, I do find it to be really important to help guide things. So.
And I think, especially because you asked it from the point of view of teaching, I think certain possibilities or certain things are possible at certain periods of time. Like, I often will have students who will be like, oh, well, this is just like Darwin, and we're looking at something in like 1700. And I'm like, okay, but we, like saying this is just like Darwin wouldn't necessarily mean something to a person in 1700. So first there is that understanding of like, okay, sometimes we need to understand what was available to people as an option for thinking through something. But I mean, one way I agree with you, Stacey, on this, I'm like a serial contextualizer, I can't stop it. But I will say that historical contextualization is a political choice we make in the present. And that's the only way I can think of it.
That was a much better way of saying it.
I think we have one question here, and this will be our final one, I think, because we need one.
Thank you so much for a wonderful evening. I'm taking it back to teaching, and particularly the structures with which we teach our students, and the idea of the whakapapa, which I'm always very fascinated by, particularly because there's someone in my life who talks about it a lot. The whakapapa seems to decenter the person and centers the community, but at the same time within the academy and when we teach, it also seems to have the potential to repersonalize the individual. And so I'm wondering how we can take that, the whakapapa, to our students when they write, when they study, that can transform what they do and how they see what they do.
With my honours class, I can't remember the name of it, but it is about making a statement about who you are when you write. And so what are you bringing into the classroom? And this is what we're taught as good teachers, who are they, what's their background, who are you bringing in your backpack, where you live, who you live with, who you were raised by. And that needs to be front and centre with everything that you do. And as teachers, that needs to be front and centre. So the way that I practice as a Māori art historian is the same whether I'm teaching about World War II looting or whether I'm teaching about museums in Canada or whether I'm teaching about contemporary art. And you can't separate that. So all we can try and do is try and get our students to also think that, to bring that with them. That is a richness that only they have and is very powerful, but they don't know it. And we just need to reinforce that. That's really our job as educators, for them to leave universities, colleges, feeling much more powerful and in control of both their past, if we can, but where they are and where they can go because of what's in that backpack.
I think, because my scholarship is predominantly in Europe, but I have, a little bit of a foothold thinking about whakapapa in like the Maori context or mo'oku'auhao in Hawaii. I think it allowed me as a scholar to be less estranged from myself and understand why the questions I ask are the questions I asked. My own relationship to Hawaii, is very challenging based on my own settler past, and it determines many of the questions I ask. And I think in earlier stages of my life, before I actually, took a class of my colleague Stacey Kamahiro, I think I imagined
dating me now.
Or maybe I'm really young. Nobody knows. Who knows?
Started at 6. Yeah.
But I think I imagined that I actually had to separate my personal self from my scholarly self, and I think that is increasingly happening in many spaces in academia, but it has a sort of like a long and really rich past, particularly with folks who are from the Pacific in particular.
But why do you do that?
Why do
you separate that?
Well, I think it comes from like an 18th century notion of reaching universality by moving away from your own individual subjectivity, which is like sort of trickled through, like higher education. And so I think I needed to re-find it because it completely powers my work. And, we talked earlier about like how I have energy for working on something that's actually really unpleasant. I work on 18th century racism. It's not happy or pretty to look at, but I think it is that notion of like trying to understand in many places what I think we could say in a more abstracted sense is like positionality, but positionality is so cold.
That's what I was thinking about, yeah.
I think it becomes so cold that I think, whakapapa or mo'oku'auhao, or even thinking about genealogy or family history, even if I'm not specifically writing the history of my family, I would say my experiences, my backpack, are always shaping the way I come to a question, the values that I bring to the research I do, who I cite, who I don't cite, who I talk to, and they're forever in the way that my work takes place. And feeling empowered by that, I think, is something that's really arisen from learning specifically from Pacific scholars.
Like Stacey.
Yes.
And you too. Yeah, I'm like soaking this in because I just love it and it just resonates with my own thoughts, and I'm in much more articulate ways. But I also think too, in our classrooms, that because, face it, when I'm teaching 250 people in a large lecture hall and I'm teaching them the art of the body in Oceania, how do you connect with them and understand? I guess part of that too is getting them to think about their own genealogies, how they've impacted the imaging of the Pacific, how the images that I'm looking at, I start actually with in the 18th century. And
I took that class.
Still teaching.
You're dating her.
No, remember, I'm just like a child prodigy.
Yeah. But thinking about how images have genealogies of their own, and just really trying to trace those. Where did they come from? How did they come to be? Where did they go? I mean, how did they end up in these collections? How do those objects that have their own genealogies get kind of sideswiped by a different genealogy that took them into a different place? And so, thinking about genealogy in that way as well, which I think also helps people think about where they've come from, where their own assumptions about the world, about themselves, about their relationships with other people, about why Polynesia continues to be exoticized in images in a certain way that it has this history, right? So yeah, just getting them to think more critically about the genealogy of these images as well, I think is really important.
Well, please join me in thanking our speakers. Really superb. And we have food and drink back there, so go and enjoy. Thank you.